Okay. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. I hope everybody can see me. And that I hope everybody is able to hear me as well. First, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming for this book review symposium. That we are going to discuss a book that recently came out titled Anatomy of the ANC in Power by Professor Ndletyana at the University of Johannesburg. My name is Thapelo Tselapedi. I'm at the Rhodes Politics Department. I'm a lecturer in the department too. Just to start off with, I'd just like to just outline a few sort of issues. First, could we just have people's phone just a bit with the sound off, so that there are no disturbances as we proceed? Secondly, also we had anticipated that the regional station called Uma Colony is unable to live broadcast any longer, but there will be a later broadcast taken from the recorded video here. But at the moment, it will be a broadcast by the Rhodes Music Radio Station that's on campus at Rhodes University, together with a live feed as well on the departmental politics department Facebook page. And thereafter it will be shared on our YouTube and then be put on various other social media platforms. I think just to sort of outline how we're going to proceed in the symposium one, we're going to have 6 reviewers. Among those reviewers, let's just start with number 1. We have Emeritus Professor Ndletyana, who is currently housed at the University of South Africa. Second, we also then have Professor Janet Cherry, who is also housed at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. Nelson Mandela University, I think it is now. Third, we also then have Professor Feroz Khan, who's at Stellenbosch University. Fourth, we then have with us Mr. Ibrahim Fakir, who is a director at our Socioeconomic Rights Institute. Fifth, then we have with us Ongama Mtimka as well at the Nelson Mandela University, I think at the politics department. And finally, we have then Lukana Mguni, both at Power FM, UKZN, and Good Governance Africa. In that order, we will ask that the reviewers at least be able to give a sort of introspection or points about what they got from the book, firstly. And then secondly, from each of them in that order, they should be able to ask a question directed to the author. Thereafter, then we will have Professor Ndletyana then talk to us on the book, but initially to then respond to the reviewers from whether the observations about the book or the questions then also related to that. And then finally, we'll have from the floor or from the audience questions that may arise, whether it's from the reviewers or the author, and the comments therein. So at the moment, I don't know if everybody is here. I don't know if Professor Emeritus Ndletyana is here. Could we please just get confirmation of that?
Prof Ndletyana is just trying to get in now. I just spoke to him now.
Okay. I think that given maybe that sort of discrepancy, we may then start with Professor Janet Cherry to take us through her thoughts on the book, and then a question directed at the author.
Thapelo?
Yes.
Thapelo? Can
Yes,
I say
Prof?
something? Yeah, can I just indicate also that the reviews that have already been written and those that we're still expecting will be published in the Journal of Contemporary African Studies, and we will also have a rejoinder that Ndletyana has agreed to write in response to the reviewers. And of course, if those reviewers feel like continuing the debate or the conversation, they're welcome to respond to the rejoinder as well. So hopefully there will be an ongoing discussion about it.
Okay, okay. I think perhaps as a parting shot for myself as well is just to say that could we just make sure that phones are silent for those who, or perhaps you just yourself for the time being unless you're speaking. But I think it's important to then just reflect a little bit on the book about, you know, the sort of party-state relations that are some of the themes in the book, the issues around. Could I just appeal? Yeah, could I just appeal just finally for background noise, either to mute unless you're speaking, or just ask Ndletyana to just check who's also making that noise and talk to them privately.
Tapelo, do you want me to start?
Yeah, I think let's start with you, Prof.
Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. And thanks very much to Rhodes for organizing this. Thank you, Prof Hendricks. I think it's a fine initiative. And I've been, I can't say reading with enjoyment, but finding the books that have been published on Nelson Mandela Bay, including Chippy Olber's book, I see he's also on this call, very dismaying and disappointing in a way, because I've been following the trajectory of democracy and development in Nelson Mandela Bay with a lot of interest for the last 3 decades. And in a way, what the main takeaway from Ndletyana's book is that there's been a profound failure of what I call a radical democratic project, which was a project which I thought 30 years ago was possible, which was one which involved very high level of participation by ordinary citizens, especially residents of working class townships in the political process. And I thought there was potential for that to become part of a more, can I say, more redistributive or radical democratic development process. And what Ndletyana's book illustrates is how that has failed, how that project has failed. Now, you know, if you look at his book, his argument essentially is that because the ANC is so hegemonic in the Nelson Mandela Bay townships, it provides an excellent case study of what went wrong with the liberation movement as it transformed into a political party. And really, I mean, what Prof Ndletyana does is place the blame squarely on the ANC as a political party. And I do actually agree with him to some extent, because it seems to me that it's not a failure of the institutional and legislative framework. And my own research has shown that democracy in the formal representative sense has been clearly consolidated. And this is demonstrated in the levels of participation in elections and in the way in which multi-party democracy and tolerance and so on have been accepted. And this is, I've seen this in multiple studies of residents of KwaZulu Township in terms of their participation. So if it's not a problem with citizen participation, and it's not a problem with the democratic structures and the legislative framework, where does this problem lie? How did things go so wrong? And I have a little bit of a contestation with one of the formulations in Prof Ndletyana's book, which is this concept of moral depravity, which I think is a very strong term. And he says moral depravity emerged as the dominant problem that afflicted the organization. And I don't think that this is a good enough explanation really for the factionalism that emerged and the consequent destruction of internal democracy within the ANC. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a reason for me why the ANC leadership could not sustain basic ethical and democratic norms within an organization like that. Even transforming into a political party as it did, even being a dominant party, even maintaining a majority in elections. So, yeah, I've been looking at Prof van Holt's argument and his paper about corruption and political economy of corruption. And he argues that it's not primarily driven by criminality, nor is it driven by moral failure, but by material accumulation and what he terms as class formation. And to quote Prof van Holt, he says, the state is the location of jobs, revenue, contracts, tenders, and licensing, and is an obvious resource in the formation of a new elite. And if you look at how this emerged, how this process unfolded, I think you'll see that Van Holt and Ndletyana are both in agreement that this process didn't begin with Jacob Zuma's presidency and what is termed now the 9 lost years of state capture. And in fact, Tibi Olver's account of state capture is looking at a particular period, but the problems predate 2014, and this is what Ndletyana argues. They are systemic within the party. And he says, and I'm quoting, its electoral decline first showed in 2009, but the causes lie in the reconfiguration of the ANC upon ascension to local office in 1995. Now, I remember 1995. I mean, I was living in PE, as I have been for a long time, and we were extremely proud. I think there may be even some people on this call who were involved in that process, that Port Elizabeth was the first city in South Africa to have a transitional local government. And that was put into place through activists within the ANC who were able to negotiate a transitional local government. So how did it go wrong from that point on? Like what was the system that emerged as a result of that? Yeah, so Ndletyana argues that this corruption which emerged was based in patronage and tenderpreneurship, which I think we all agree with, and that this had begun at least a decade before the 2016 elections. So let's say 2005, 2006, and that sort of period. And he says this period dealt a severe blow to the integrity of the party through erosion of rules, exodus and purge of some of the credible local leaders, and it would prove difficult in subsequent years to rebuild the integrity of the organization. So I think that one of the questions is how did the system of patronage emerge? How did it subvert the ANC? And to be brief, I don't think it's a democratic failure of the electoral process. I think it is an internal process within the ANC. And I think a more convincing argument than moral failure lies in the material interests of ordinary people who are excluded from the economy. So this is not quite the same as to argue that there is a new black bourgeoisie or a form of, that it's a form of primitive accumulation. And I would argue that that is not actually the correct term to use. But my question, let me finish there. I mean, I could say a lot more, but my question to Prof Ndletyana is, do you think that there has been the formation of a black bourgeoisie, or at least a new Black elite in Nelson Mandela Bay? Has this been the outcome of this process, which you've described in such detail? Let me leave it at that for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. Could we then, I'm told that Professor Ndletyana is here. Prof, are you there?
Yeah, thank you very much. Apologies for joining rather late.
No problem. So right now what we're doing is to go through each reviewer so that you comment on the book or give snapshot of the book as you've read it, and then direct a question to the author. We can move on to the next reviewer and then come to you later, or we can have you speak on it now. I don't know, which one would you prefer?
You're asking me?
Yes.
I'm ready to speak on it now.
Okay, no, that's fine. We'll start with we'll carry on with you then.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, colleagues, for the invitation. At first, to contribute a review of the book by Prof Ndletyana, The Anatomy of the ANC in Power. Thank you very much for putting together this webinar for a wider group to reflect on the work that Ndletyana has done. Thank you very much for inviting me, as it were, to contribute in the manner in which I did with the review that I have done on the book. Let me say, first of all, that I'm very delighted and pleased with the work that Professor Ndletyana has done. First, I'm delighted that it has brought once again the spotlight on Nelson Mandela Bay and Port Elizabeth in terms of as a case study of the African National Congress in power as far as it relates to local government. Secondly, I'm rather delighted because I come from Port Elizabeth, and that's where I cut my teeth in politics. I have got a particular view about Port Elizabeth and the politics of Port Elizabeth. And thirdly, to some extent, I was familiar with the story that Professor Ndletyana told relating to persons and their backgrounds and where they come from. Although naturally, being the kind of age that I am, many of the names are not immediately familiar to me. And I do want to say that the book itself is very detailed. The book is very informative. The analysis, its political analysis is very sharp. And the research, to the extent that it is contemporary history, has got a level of authenticity about it, and it didn't spare the critical eye of Professor Ndletyana, which most of us are familiar with from his own work that we do. I wanted to say, however, that while I welcome the book and the study as a study in the local politics in a place of my birth and the place where I live, I did raise some, probably three, maybe more questions that need attention, and to which Professor Ndletyana didn't engage. As a background to that, let me say that the strange sort of thing about South Africans is that South Africans have a kind of love-hate relationship with the African National Congress. It's a movement that we like to criticize and which we think is dismal in terms of performance and what its politics and what it does. But it's a movement that we consistently and persistently we vote for in power without any thought about what the consequences are, and we get surprised after that. That kind of spills over, in my view, to a very worrying trend where we focus on the ANC as observers and interpreters and analysts. There is probably too much focus on ANC as if there's nothing else that's going on in the country. And by so doing, we create this, this thing called the ANC, without which this nation cannot be itself. And in the piece that I did, Cebisi will probably be familiar with this, that while there is so much wrong with the ANC, but somehow South Africans cannot think outside of the box of the ANC. And the political elite that the ANC has brought up causes the ANC to be very, very reluctant to be truly and meaningfully self-critical of itself. The second point of criticism that I raise, Cebisi, is that in my view, one of the greatest, and at the time it would not have seemed like a mistake, one of the greatest shortcomings of the ANC, and to that extent, I'm not surprised that it has become what it is. You make a big point in the study about the influence of the Robben Island veterans like Omgov and Omray. Now, the truth of the matter is that those are, now I was active in Port Elizabeth at the time. Those are people who actually have not been in Port Elizabeth since about 1960, 1961. So by 1990, 1989, 1990, actually they've been out of the scene for as long as what is it, 30 years? So strangely enough, in your book, you make a big point about the fact that the emergence of the new leadership owed a lot to people who really had been in prison or at Robben Island for almost, and therefore didn't follow sufficiently or experience sufficiently the events that were happening in the city. And I could talk volumes about what was happening in the city, really basically from the time of the 1964, and the people who came back from the island in the 1966 era, and what happened to them and what it did to the thing that was called Port Elizabeth. I have a gap as well because I spent 15 years in exile. I recognize that I personally have a period of it from 1978 to 1993 that I really can no longer speak authoritatively about. But thankfully, there are names of people as young people that I actually recognize from the time when I was in house arrest and banned in Port Elizabeth and as an article clerk at Kondile and Somyalo during a period of, say, about 6 years. And therefore, it seems to me that the book doesn't do the ANC much favor by, which may well be true, I'm not saying it's not true, because the reality is that because of the intellectual shortcomings of the ANC as it came and the experiential shortcomings, many of the people actually didn't really know Omgov and Omray, didn't really know what happened in 1960, 1961 in Port Elizabeth or in the Nelson Mandela area. And therefore for them, this idea that the people in 1991, 93, who were there to draw from whom we drew the idea of what the future should look like, seemed to me to be a kind of rosy-eyed and unrealistic way of saying, how does the future look like? You can't look back in order to construct a future. And for that reason, however, personally, because I lived at New Brighton all that time, I lived in Post Village, and I'm very much aware what the names Ray Mhlaba and Govan Begi actually meant. But I cannot believe that Prof Ndletyana in 2001, drawing from 1991, and how uncritically the people in New Brighton actually appropriated that which they received. And the reason being, from Ndletyana's own narration, that is because they appeared to be bringing a knowledge of the history of the Port Elizabeth struggle years from 1955 and that sort of thing, which many of them actually knew little or nothing about. And therefore they appropriated it lock, stock and barrel almost totally uncritically. The third thing I think that, I keep saying third, I'm not sure whether I'm at the third now. Prof Ndletyana actually helpfully, because I actually do believe that politics and leadership are a very, very important components of understanding how trends in politics actually go. He narrates the emergence of the big person, in this case, in particular of Nceba Faku, but latterly of whatever his name is, Linda. What's his name now? It escapes me for a moment. Linda. So this idea of the big, influential, powerful, controlling person in the politics of the city actually had never been the case at the time when Ngov and Ray and others were active, including at the time when not much mention is made of him these days, Dr. Njongwe and others who were leaders in Port Elizabeth at the time. This idea of the big man politics, who is the elite, who is uncontrollable, who basically is the one who gives and calls others and brings others and divides the movement. It seems to me that this emergence of the big man politics in PE really Ndletyana hints at this and doesn't develop it so much, is the extent of the failure of the ANC as the governing party across all spheres of government, where it has been just completely unable to deal with big man situations, except to try to draw into that big man politics in the local area, as they did with Nceba Faku and later on with Linda. So the emergence of the big man politics, if I may say so, I think this is a problem we're having with Jacob Zuma at the moment. This concept of the big man politics that is larger than life, larger than the party itself. And many others are beggars for him, and he himself is not the one who is accountable and answerable sufficiently and adequately to the party itself. Then I think I'm talking in sort of themes here, so basically you'll forgive me. Then I think that in the way in which local government has come up and has emerged, one of the points I make is the politicization of local government in the big P level. In other words, the party politicization of local government. I don't think we have paid enough attention to the damage that we have done in South Africa by exceedingly politicization in terms of the big P, in terms of party politics. And in a place like Port Elizabeth, I suggest we're seeing the collapse of the big P politicization of local government. And I say that with a degree of hesitancy because I recognize that there are things that are political about any sphere where human nature is engaged in struggle. But I also want to emphasize that for many ordinary people, what really matters in local government, who pay their rates and their rents and their taxes and what you call it, they want to know that they have jobs, they have food, they want to know that their streets are paved, they want to know that there are social activities in place, they've got healthcare. They want to know whoever it is, they've got a roof over their heads. Now, it seems to me that we in South Africa have lost touch with what the purpose of local government actually is. And I suggest that the role of ideology in terms of the party political sense only has a very limited traction in the way in which people at the local level are actually looking at local government. I suggest that in a place like Port Elizabeth, since I think it was 2016, if I'm not mistaken, or 2018, since the last local government that produced a hung council, I suggest that at that point, it appears to have mattered very little whether the mayor was ANC or PAC or AIC or whatever it is, or whoever it is. That for many ordinary people, there was a concern was that, is this person who is the mayor trustworthy? Is this person to be trusted with the resources of the city? Is this person delivering on the key components of living in a city, in a place like this? The emphasis in Ndletyana's book, unfortunately, is really about the materialism and the thieving and all of that, important as that might be, but very little about what is the role of local government, how does it actually touch the hearts and minds of people in the city, and the extent to which the local government and local governance was actually departed from where the people of the city actually were. And those who voted for it actually didn't seem to be moved by the ideological issues that were at play in local government. So in local government, I imagine, I may be wrong, I imagine that most of the people locally are concerned about who actually runs the city. Is it Kalata House, James Kalata House? Is it Luthuli House? Is it Union Buildings? But who are these people ultimately accountable to? Are they accountable to us as the residents of this place? Or are they, because if they're not accountable to us, they're accountable to Luthuli House, the gulf and the distance between Luthuli House and the local is so vast that for many people, I suspect, there is very little recognition and appreciation of what difference does it make if the city is controlled from Luthuli House, is controlled from Union Buildings, or indeed is controlled from James Kalata House. For many people, ultimately, They want to know what are the local areas about safety and about security, about poverty, about alienation, about housing, about water, about sanitation. At the end of the day, those are the things that actually matter. So I make the point that sooner or later, we need to move towards what I call a new ideology and a new conception of ideology in the local government sphere. And what that new ideology is something that people who vote for ANC turn around the following day and toi for service delivery. The ideology of service delivery is in fact the new ideology that has come about and frankly, we need to come to terms with. My last point then, even while appreciating the book, I said in my review that while I was going along with Professor Ndletyana and appreciated it, and I was looking forward, in fact, I started with the conclusion of the book. I was looking forward to really trying to say, what then, having given us all of this very rich and very detailed synoptic analysis of this city that I love so much, which is my home, where is it that Professor Ndletyana is taking us or sees the future? And frankly, my dear brother, I was disappointed. I found, in fact, that what you did in the end was a summary, and I'd like us to hear more about that, was a summary of the book that had gone, but I wanted to, and I had hoped that you would actually look forward and say, what will it take for a different and alternative local government to actually emerge? And I suggest that part of the reason that it didn't come to that is that too many of us are kind of atrophied. We are standstill. We are like Lot's wife. When it comes to the ANC, we cease to think beyond the ANC. We cease to really and truly recognize a future without the ANC. And the reality is that at local government, I suspect, and I may not be saying the same thing, by the way, about national level, but at local government, we need a mechanism that actually frees people to actually vote into local government, people they have trust in. Not organizations they have trust in, but people, human beings, they know and they trust. And it seems to me that we are nowhere near a conception of local government, which came at the time, I suspect, as a hodgepodge of trying to do something that is a mixture of what happens at national government and to pay deference to the local conditions as well. So my idea is that we need a major and a radical relook at local government, and the book by Professor Ndletyana gives us a case study of how in an ideal world that I suspect, and I'd like to think Port Elizabeth was, that will give us the material, the elements of how to reconstruct and rethink an appropriate local government environment that we have got. And basically what I am saying is that we've got it all wrong. And that so far, what I would have liked to have seen Professor Ndletyana in that last chapter would have been to say that you can go to Johannesburg, you can go to Tshwane, you can go to Cape Town, you can come to Nelson Mandela Bay. We've got local government all wrong. We need to go back to the drawing board and reconceptualize local government afresh. Thank you very much. Can I stop there and hear how you come back at me. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Prof. I think you give us a lot to also reflect on, particularly the challenge directed at the author, Professor Ndletyana. I think then the next reviewer that we have is Professor Feroz Khan. I take it you are with us in the session, Professor?
Yes.
Okay, so it's just a matter of just a reflection, a sort of a brief reflection on the book, and then the question directed to the author. Yeah, all right. Could you please just unmute, or Mr. Raymond, could you please unmute Prof? Raymond, could you please unmute Prof?
Hello.
Okay.
Hi.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk about the book. I missed the first part of it, so I'm just going to just briefly talk about my review. But first of all, to just say that I found it is a book of historical record, and it's extremely important, I think, not just for people in the local government sphere, but anybody who wants to understand the ANC and what the ANC is about. I think it also signals and signposts how the ANC was the kind of author of its own demise, and I think it does that very extensively. It also looks at kind of ethnography, official documents, and archival material, and puts us all in a nice perspective. I mean, some of the problems I have with the book is that, well, let me just start with, it's the tale that the book is talking about is how the ANC moved from a kind of emancipatory to a kind of rent-seeking instrument, in the words of the author himself in another publication. And what we see is that we see this is the worship of currency, in the sense the worship the god is being currency and the god being money. And it seems as if this all forms of competition are allowed within this context, and that in the end, what happens is that the only thing left of the revolutionary idea is the idea to stay in office itself. That was left of the idea, and it's said that revolutions rise to power on the strength of an idea, and end only when the only idea left is to stay in power. And I think, and that's what the ANC did. I mean, that's what happened. Eventually, it degenerated into that. But I think that what the book misses is that I think that there's a certain, and I'm raised in the view, that the book doesn't talk about the ideological baggage carried by some of the key people, by some of the key people in the book, i.e. the kind of governing Bekis or Raymond Schlambers or people high up in the ANC, considering the kind of class composition and origin of the ANC. I think it misses that, and I think some argue that it was a middle-class organization, and as a result, therefore, its values were not as noble as what we learn about. And I think that some of that ideological baggage was carried through, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Why? The second thing is that I think that there's a kind of continuity. Before I come to that, I think that what it does suggest is that the literature is now suggesting that there are limits in the kind of national liberation movement understanding of change, i.e. where is actually the people who claim to be part of the anti-system are actually now part of the establishment. And they're saying that so the liberators can't claim that, and they say the same thing in ZANU, in SWAPO, in ANC since the 80s. And I was in 94, for example, in notions that the kind of arrogance of power, etc. But these things, all I'm simply saying is that there was an ideological baggage, I think, which is not taken into consideration. And that ideological baggage, I think, marks in large part why there's a continuity. There's a continuity between past and present and how people experience the state. And I think that what for me, though, just to come back to some of the issues that I have, the biggest problem I have with the book at this moment in time is that there's a view that there was an ideological dimension, or somehow there was a moral fortitude that was lost somehow along the way, and that there was an older leadership who had possibly had experience when engaged in the organization, and who acted like some kind of moral lightning rod, or rather kind of moral guidance. And it's almost assumed that when these people left, or when these people left the national elections, or they left other levels of government, that this thing was gone. Now, the point of what the author does not explain is that he might explain about the sins of incumbency, about the failure of incumbency, but he doesn't explain to us what happened to the incumbents themselves. What happened to the change in ideology? What happened to the movement from what might is called the kind of ideas of noble ideas into the ideas of kind of acquisition, etc., etc. I mean, and you cannot say that it was just simply the lack of legislation, because the lack of legislation, quite frankly, I mean, Chip is always here. The lack of legislation was always there. I mean, all municipalities were affected by that lack of legislation. In fact, local government, you know, at one point is that thing that government had to be reminded at one point in the transition that actually you needed local government transition legislation. I mean, that's how bad it was. I mean, I know some funders were reminding government of that. So, I mean, I don't see what's unique about that part of the story, because all of them had that kind of problem. So the issue is that what is it that kind of evolved and made it evolve from this towards this kind of antithetical cultural outlook of acquisition, etc., versus the noble ideas which were betrayed. So, I mean, that's the one thing which I don't pick up in this book. And I think that I'm going to stop there, and I want to hear more. And sorry, and the last more thing is that, and of course, the million-dollar question: what's the way forward? I think that maybe the purpose of the book was not to suggest a way forward. And I think maybe to look for something like that in the book may be a bit unfair. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Prof. We can now then have Mr. Ibrahim Fakir.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me, and thanks for this kind invitation. I'm not a political scientist or an academic, and so I'm really pleased that I've been invited to this academic symposium and to provide some thoughts. First off, obviously, congratulations to Prof Ndletyana. I found the book really helpful, comprehensive, and located in a historical institutional studies perspective. There's a good periodization into the period of transition and then the period of transformation of local government. I agree with many of the sentiments that have been echoed by the previous speakers, including Professor Khan, Professor Ndletyana, and Professor Cherry. But I am going to say that I was struck by the comprehensiveness of this book. But in that comprehensiveness lay a little bit of a problem, in the sense that the devil is in the detail. And there perhaps is a little bit too much detail into this. But, you know, for an empiricist or positivist like me, that might in fact be a good thing, because it allows you to underpin with a series of facts, no matter how detailed they are, some of the issues and trends and things, which events, activities, which underscore the hypotheses which have been set out in the introductory chapter, which Professor Ndletyana does fairly helpfully in setting out 8 or 9 sort of axioms around patronage, around the blunting of oversight, around the way in which political structures adapted to government and how government structures adapted to accommodate politics inside the ANC and the alliance. And so you get all those facts and you get the detail, but of course you can get a little bit lost in the detail. That's a minor weakness in the book. Now, that's a very minor weakness. And in any event, as I say, empiricists like me like some of that kind of detail, because it allows you to put meat into the bones of the kind of general superstructure of the argument made in the book. Now, located as it is in the kind of historical institutional studies paradigm, periodizing as it does, and I agree with Prof Khan, it will serve as a moment of historical record, but I think it also provides a great reflection of the way in which in political studies, people would be interested in how how politics shapes government and how government is shaped by politics, because there's been a tendency in some points to take these in isolation from each other. So a focus merely on government without enough of a focus on how the politics have shaped government, and sometimes a focus merely on the politics without thinking about what the implications on government are. And so Prof Ndletyana draws quite a nice mix of the two and shows us what the primacy of politics would be and what its consequences would be on development and on government performance. Of course, it's helpful also in the fact that there's that much detail. There's an interplay between, and it shows, the book shows the interplay between structure, function, and agency. And on this theme of structure, function, and agency, one of the weaknesses I found, which was a strength in the first chapter, which I outlined how different communities, so in the northern areas, in the white, historically white suburbs, but also the townships, how historically the sociological and political perspective which underlined political agency in those communities shaped the transition period, but doesn't sufficiently go into the way in which those politics played out in party support patterns. So there is an outline of how the party support patterns played out, but merely in the way in which it shaped government. Now, I understand that a book can't cover everything, but I did find that I did think that I would have found that a little more helpful. I mean, the book is long as it is. It could have done with a little bit of greater length. So the third thing the book brings out fairly strongly is the overall focus of the ANC merely on capturing political power rather than in the administration of political power. And in doing this, in showing how the focus has been on the capture of power rather than on the process of administering power, Ndletyana goes to great lengths in showing how the political structures of the ANC, the region, the province, the national, adapts to dealing with the local and who's in the local council. And then shows how the local council itself and the politics in the council, its caucus, adapts to accommodate the politics of the alliance and the ANC, either regionally, provincially, or nationally. And there's very little of that which is done in other books, perhaps in Olga's book on PE. But you know, though this is a micro study of Port Elizabeth, it does have major lessons for how we understand and interpret what and how our politics and governance is evolving nationally. The fourth thing that I found struck me is the focus on local government and the focus on the regional executive politically of the ANC, and how central the regional executives can be as arbiters of power in relation to the province and in nationally. But it also shows in great detail the manipulation of structures, the manipulation of processes in the party, but also the manipulation of processes in government to deal and to pursue a narrowly defined set of objectives. Not many of those objectives which are either meant to advance the interests of the party or the interests of community that it is governing. And so this is something which we've instinctively been talking about in the public debate, but this book goes into great detail in outlining how that abuse, how that manipulation of process and structure is attuned to achieving these fairly narrow political perspectives. And so underscoring both the importance of regional politics, but also the importance of local government is one of the features which I found quite useful of this book. Fifthly, the question of the mode of internal opposition is an idea which is now moribund. It elides the idea that all interests aggregate in the ANC and in the alliance, and there is a way in which this idea, which is propounded across the society, elides and hides some of the abuses of authority, the manipulation of process, and the manipulation of institution. And so, you know, the idea that the region, the idea that local government is a fundamental cog in the evolution of our politics and our government shows how each have to adapt to the other. But in making this adaptation, there's also ways in which blatant abuse of process, but also the blatant disregard of the law and disregard of process and procedure that you yourself have decided on, is clearly outlined. So the question of this forensic report, which was ordered, was simply not tabled in council. And not tabling in council is a procedural measure which has a major political effect. So the procedural measure is that because the Auditor General's report is not tabled in council, much of it can't be spoken about publicly. And so it politically is able to hide the misdemeanors of a whole lot of people. And yet there's a faction or a portion in the ANC which wants this publicly handled, but it can't be because of the intervention of the regional political structure. And so that conflict, that internal political conflict and the manner in which it shapes government is nicely brought out. It's a helpful book for all, for everyone to read, not just academics, not just intellectuals, for anyone interested in the evolution of our politics and our government. But I think it would be especially helpful for people in political studies, for people in government and public policy, to look at this interrelationship between the two and how the one shapes the other. On the grand question of moral degradation versus whether this is merely structural and emergent out of an interest for creating new class formation and class ascendancy, I'm afraid I would have to come down on the side of the evidence, as painstakingly pointed out by Ndletyana, and also in Olga's book, that it's clear when you look at the adaptation and the abuse of process, that the abuse of process is done merely for narrow accumulation purposes. That's not about broad class formation, because broad class formation would be about how does this provide ascendancy for underclasses in society. These abuses of authority, these manipulation of processes and institutions were merely done for a fairly narrow set of acquisitive interests. Now, because my focus has been largely structural and functional, the question I would leave you with, Ndletyana, because I have to ask you one question, is, you point out how PE and many other metros went for an executive mayor model. Would we have had a different evolution had we had an EXCO model adopted? Would power have been more diffused? Would it have been more difficult for them to adapt and abuse institutions and processes inside the party and inside the state to achieve these narrow objectives? The last point I would want to make is that you do go on when you talk about how the Polokwane moment overshadowed what starts to happen provincially and regionally, about the question of neoliberalism and austerity. And you premise a lot of that austerity on the question of cost recovery or revenue collection at the local level, when in fact the austerity was much larger. It's about neoliberal approach to the way in which market reforms are adopted, and the way in which cost-cutting measures means that redistribution is hampered, maintenance is hampered, repair of basic services is hampered. So those effects are much more acutely felt, rather than just the idea that, we now have cost recovery, we don't want to pay, and that's like an added cog in the machine of social conflict. But overall, I found the book very useful, a little bit difficult to read because of the sheer detail, but as I say, the detail can be a strength. And there isn't much of weakness in the book, and so that's me. There you have it. Having never written a book, I feel like a bit of a fraud having to provide a review, but be that as it may, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Ibrahim. We're then going to move to Ndletyana Mandimka from Nelson Mandela.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. It's quite an honor to be here, write the review, and give a little bit of comment about it. I must say that this was quite an interesting thing to do, because the latter years of, in fact, I think between 2009 and 2011, I was a spokesperson in the municipality when some of these shenanigans were happening. And in fact, I remember our job became very difficult because in that time there were two contending political factions, and we could never, speak in ways that made sure that we stayed clear of being accused of belonging to the factions. So it was a really good book to read post facto. First, I've structured my review in this way. So I reflect on the concept and methodology, then look at the political implications of diverse struggle traditions, and then look at the latter chapters, party-state relations and decay. On the concept and methodology, I think Prof's work proves the efficacy of case studies in understanding political phenomena. Within the tradition of comparative politics, you do comparison, but also there's a study of subnational systems. And the intention with subnational systems is that when you zero in on an aspect of a political system, you may gain much deeper insights, which may help explain the systemic in more nuanced ways, or in ways that help us accommodate some drivers of change, which are not immediately apparent when we're looking at it from a macro perspective. I also comment about what is not declared necessarily as the core approach of the book, which is autoethnography. I think Prof Ndletyana could not have done this book as well as he did had he himself not been coming from PE and not have known some of the political actors, because you can see from their accounts that the subjects are talking to somebody whom they trust and therefore have been able to yield great insights, which I doubt would have, arisen had the research been done by somebody else. So if you look at some of the major works that have been produced in PE, the best have been by people who come from the city who adopted a autoethnographic approach to their inquiry as much as they did some other research method. Now, if I go to the first issue for me, which is the political implications of diverse struggle traditions. What we see in this section, I think it's in the first two chapters of the book, is the making of the drivers of change that would set in pace right from the onset the weakness of the party. So Prof reflects on the fact that the ANC inherits the organizational architecture of the mass democratic movement. But as soon as the party begins to rebuild, one of the things that it faces is a clash of those traditions when it comes to what kind of cadreship do they bequeath to the party. You've got the exiles and those that have been in prison who are presumed to know the party better, as if the party is stuck somewhere in history in a static form. And as we saw when Prof Ndletyana was presenting, the movement was changing as much as the organization or the conditions of struggle were changing on the ground, to the extent that even those in mass democratic structures who were participating and had not known the party before or were not prominent in the party had learned something about what was the emerging approaches that were more effective during their time, better than some of the people who had been, who had joined the party before being imprisoned or going into exile. But it's interesting that in the psyche of the membership of the party, these notions of seniority and who knows the ANC better have lasted very long. And in fact, Cyril, part of the reasons why President Cyril Ramaphosa's suitability for leadership has been around this notion of whether he knows the ANC after having been a Secretary General and had prominent positions in the party, precisely because when one traces his genesis within the party, he cannot be found in the in the 1960s period and 1970s. So for me, it's important. It's very interesting how these dynamics influence leadership contestations within the party, not that during the period of the transition, but beyond it. What I noted, though, is that the tendency to contest, the tendency to want to influence who gets to be a successor and the tendency to contest leadership is not a new tendency, as we begin to see in the lexicon of the party in the late 1990s and throughout the 2000s. It's part of the initial seeds of the remaking of the party right from the onset, as Prof, for example, shows how the 1991 conference becomes very much contested, and the notions of seniority are almost thrown out of the window, even though they are resilient in terms of contesting with the young and emerging leaders of the party. So it was quite interesting to see how those tendencies have endured. The tendency to want to impose a successor if you are the incumbent, or to structure who gets to emerge as a leader versus the contestation of that. And then the last section that I look at is the party-state relations and decay. It's quite interesting that this contestation gets to increase over time. And I would like to read from my reviews here. A major aspect in the trajectory of contestation is the decline in the values of the party as the vital constituents of its institutional heritage, namely the principles, values, and morality or the structure. It becomes subject to the political will and ambitions of leaders within the party, that is the agents. So when we see it in this way, what we begin to challenge the emerging theoretical position that the decay of the party arises from exogenous factors, as though that are inside the party have tended to state new tendencies or influences from outside the party. We begin to see the contestations and the disregard for comradeliness or for the sustainability of the party as an endogenous part of ANC politics, not something that arises outside of it. And this leads to my last point that I'd like to make in the review. So one of the commentators here said something that to the effect that liberation movements end when the only ideal left is to stay in power. My view is that in PE, this was quite the opposite, and in fact, even nationally. If there was a recognition at some stage that the warring factions were going to cost the ANC staying in power, at some stage, that would have been enough reason to help the party to clean house and get them to want to secure their continued governance. But that was not the case. As early as the 2009 general election, it was very clear that the ANC was going to lose in subsequent elections. But that threat of losing support in the near future was not enough to galvanize the organization at a regional, provincial, and national levels to attempt to act in the best interest, never mind of the country or the city, but in the best interest of the party in terms of ability to continue to govern. So this is leading me to pose the question which I pose as an important aspect of getting to understand exactly what happens. What happens when an organization or the activists of a party who had sacrificed their lives to fight for that party, when they get to be in a situation where the sustainability of that party no longer becomes a consideration in governing or policing the conduct of the activists or even its organizational structures, but that people pursue their private interests, even in ways that are counterproductive, one, to wanting to stay in power, and two, to continue to steal. Because whether you look at the accounts by Crispian Oliver, I think Prof Cherry and Gary Prevo, as well as Prof Ndletyana, one thing becomes clear: there doesn't get to be a stage where either the ANC at a local, provincial, or national level decides to act in the best interest of itself. You find that, and Prof attributes this to the legacy of the war between Mbeki and Zuma, that the idea of party sustainability becomes long gone by the time you reach the 2010s, to the extent that what matters is factional sustainability and the ability to continue to extract resources or money more than the party itself. So how I phrased this question, Prof, which I'd like to pose, is one that looks at, sorry, let me just get it from the, so I'll say perhaps what the book falls short on, and may be room for further research, may be a psychoanalytical approach to the makings of factions. A critical aspect of such an analysis could be the conditions under which people who had sacrificed their early lives fighting for liberation could be so entrenched in factional battles that even the idea of party sustainability is not enough a motive to cause factions to compromise for the greater good of the party. What caused political actors from local to national to allow their private alliances to become so much more important than the party itself in their minds? Thank you.
Thank you, Ongam. I think there's been a lively discussion or rather from the reviewers. We would have had Mr. Lukhona Mnguni. I think he's unable to connect for some other reason. So concerning the reviewers, we'll stop here. Even though we've breached the hour period, I think it's important to just continue. So I just ask those who are still here just to give it more time, so that at least Professor Ndletyana is able to then also respond to the reviewers, including the comments that have been made from them. I think also there's been a lively conversation happening in the chat, and I think that's quite important. I'm hoping that Professor Ndletyana has sort of also just put his eye there to see the discussions happening on. But again, thank you to the reviewers. I think let me sort of give this moment to Ntate Cebisi to take us through the book and perhaps also address some of the questions that were raised, given also the weaknesses given about the book.
Thank you, Thapelo, and thanks for all the comments. I appreciate the compliments and even more so the critique. I won't go into detail, Thapelo, about the book. I'll simply focus myself on the questions and the problems that were raised, and perhaps in addressing those, then I would be elaborating as well on the book. The questions pretty much divide into three. There's one about local government, you have another on ideology, and perhaps on the tension between material accumulation and the role of morality or moral consciousness in that activity. Let me start off with, and also the book, the purpose of the book. See, at times reviews, important as they are and necessary as they are, tend to reflect reviewers' own biases, what they would have preferred to see. Possibly what they're interested in and would want you to have addressed, and perhaps sometimes fail to treat or to appreciate what the book was really about. But read it with their own interest in mind. Let's, for instance, start with Professor Khan's comment on analysis of the ANC's ideological character. And of course, I guess what he's saying there is that the subsequent failures of the ANC were not necessarily surprising because the ANC had been bourgeois in orientation, and therefore, that is as a nationalist movement, and therefore coming into power would inevitably pursue bourgeois aspirations that I would imagine are inevitably corrupt in nature. The debate about the ideological character of the ANC has been had elsewhere many a times. I'm really, it helps, but I don't think for this book, it would have really added any value. And I think the ideological character of the ANC is pretty clear. I don't think my analysis of it would have added any value. And given that that issue had been exhausted and is obvious, it therefore has no value to be interrogated, I think. There's nothing new to unearth. And so it presented itself as a futile point for me to pursue. What I did seek to do in the book was to explain what had happened in PE. And that exactly, I think I tried to do and might have succeeded somewhat, as some of you have said. That's the first point. And perhaps that links somewhat to Prof Ndletyana's point about providing the way ahead. Hey, Mfundisi, and it's a valid question. So what is to be done? That too, I'm afraid, was not one of the aims of my book. But I did hint, though, to some degree about what the future holds. And my prediction was a little bit pessimistic. That even though the ANC had been losing power and, even in 2019, they regained somewhat in PE, but the reason why they regained a little bit of support was because of the Cyril factor. But as a party, they didn't really jack up their act. And so my prediction was that they would continue to decline, especially because they themselves as local leaders have not demonstrated that they are worthy of being elected into office. And that's partly the reason. I don't think that the electorates are necessarily, too forgiving of the ANC, allowing the ANC to go scot-free. I think they are punishing them a little bit, especially if you look at how they've performed in 2016. I mean, part of the reason why the DA won was not because the DA made inroads into Black electorates. It is because Black people simply stayed at home. And that on its own is some kind of a verdict, of a backlash from the electorate as a result of lack of service delivery. So the change is not drastic, quite correct. It's not drastic. However, there is a little bit of alienation of electoral support from the ANC, and I think it's going to become even worse in this election. Because the ANC in this election, there's really no reason why folks in the metro should vote for the ANC. Absolutely no reason. Since 2016. And so you will see more of that punishment. And so still on the comments by Prof Ndletyana on how we reconfigure local government in light of the challenges. And I think the examples that you pointed out in your review of Makana is quite appropriate. In fact, we do need some reforms insofar as that is concerned. I'm not sure how this new district model municipality is going to address some of these things. I haven't quite looked at it, but one of the areas where we certainly do need reforms in is in the area of provincial intervention in the instance of a failing municipality to provide remedy. That mechanism is completely useless. Ayisebenzi tu kwaphela. And the reason why it's not working, it is because it's not undertaken in an honest manner. Part of the reason, like for instance, if a municipality fails, especially if it fails to pass a budget and it gets into serious economic problems, then the province must come in. But most of the time, part of the reason why municipalities are embezzling funds, allocations earmarked for a particular budget simply disappear and that project doesn't materialize is because provincial leaders are also beneficiaries of this local impropriety. So you have alliances between province and regional leaders. Part of the reason why provincial leaders insist on the appointment of some of the MMCs, for instance, is so that they elect guys who would facilitate their share in the municipal budget. In fact, Chippy writes about this quite eloquently in his book, that Dennis Jordan was opposed to Mabuyane telling him who to appoint MEC of this or that. And Jesse Duarte appealed to Danny or to Chippy or someone else close to Danny, saying, Danny must not be so resistant to the PEC telling him who to appoint because that's what they have done anyway. And for him to stay in that position, to strengthen his stay in that position, he must concede to some of these instructions. So the point then is that when this malfeasance happens, when monies go missing, the province, whose responsibility is to intervene and correct, turns a blind eye. They don't, because they are too implicated in the siphoning of the monies that leave municipalities bankrupt. The only time that they get to intervene is when there's a huge crisis, as in Grahamstown, where people had to protest to attract the attention of the provincial government, right? So these provincial interventions are simply token. It's just posturing to give the impression that they're doing something. And when they do that, they have an administrator. Some of these administrators are entirely ineffective. They come up with a plan. Some of them are even chased out before they get to implement the plan. So, I mean, I'm yet to see a study, or perhaps one should do a study on this. I haven't seen a provincial administration that has been successful in turning around a municipality. I would be very happy for someone to point me to one. And it would be an interesting case to study. So my proposal there, Prof Ndletyana, is that don't allow provinces to act alone in that role of intervening. Local people who are aggrieved should have another recourse other than provincial government. My suggestion is that they should also be allowed to approach courts because provinces can simply turn a blind eye. You cannot make provinces the only port of call or recourse to deal with with municipal problems, because they are part of the problem. So you need an independent arbiter most likely the judiciary, to be part of that process, to monitor and make sure that things are done properly and all that. So for me, that would be part of the reforms at a local government level. Then we come to the issue of the idea of moral depravity. And Janet was right in pointing to Carl's study. Carl's study has been quite informative on this point. And this links somewhat to one of the points that was raised by Professor Carl. And perhaps I should deal with that before I come to Janet's point about this corruption, the point that I ascribe the onset of malpractices to lack of legislation, which barred actually councillors from doing business with the municipality in the early 90s. And he says, Prof. Khan, that legislation can't be the only explanation for why people started embezzling funds or pretty much using their office for personal gain. You see, I think we should accept the fact that self-preservation is a very basic human instinct. And so given a chance, especially people who are in a bind, going through a hellish period, in need of money, need to support themselves. And as Janet says, there isn't any other opportunity around. If they're given that opportunity to accumulate, to satisfy a very real need in the absence of any other alternative, they would take those opportunities to accumulate, this crass accumulation. So that is that's part of human nature, I think. Ongama, I don't think we need psychoanalysis to understand that. I think it's basic. And so the only way you prevent that is through laws and institutions, right? Institutions and laws channel human behavior. They encourage this value system that accords with how society wants to live, with the moral order that society wants to. In the absence of that strong enforcement of laws and a particular institutional behavior, you allow for spaces for people to engage in these opportunistic acts of impropriety. So those laws are quite important, primarily because of that it limits the possibility of people doing as they please, especially because there's a threat of punishment. And then come back to Professor Cherry's point on moral depravity and primitive accumulation. As I was saying earlier, primitive accumulation is inevitable, getting around the system, cutting corners. You're in a bind and you can always rationalize this, especially, liberation heroes, right? And given the unpredictability of public office, especially in the ANC, you are in today, tomorrow you're out, everyone wants to go in, they all want to eat, and it's a revolving door, it's a long queue. Others are in a rush. And that is why when some of them talk about corruption and the need to fight corruption, others are complaining, but why are you talking of anti-corruption now? You were eating earlier on, we are not complaining. No one raised issues of corruption. And now because it's us, all of a sudden you have discovered this sense of morality. So that corruption is inevitable because it can be rationalized. However, I don't think the fact that there is an irresistible lure for accumulation because one is without necessarily mean that there should not be any consideration for a moral consciousness or moral issues, right? Especially because, and I mean, part of the argument for me is that I'm evaluating the ANC on its own merit. I'm not bringing something else to measure the ANC, but measuring the ANC against what it says. And part of the liberation struggle, I think Biko says this, was also based on an ethical foundation. It was not just about the seizure of power. And societies generally have been driven by a particular set of ideas. And therefore, the physical configuration of society, of state, is really an outward manifestation of a particular set of ideas, particular set of values. So then we cannot get to a point where we say, well, morality does not count because people are eager to accumulate. So they have to accumulate, accord importance to this material accumulation over observance of the moral order. Because then it is a deviation, a failure, in fact, for the ANC to live up to its own character. Because the ANC itself, it says it's about creating a society molded by a particular set of ideas. And this is what the ANC has been saying from early. I mean, Sol Plaatje, not Sol Plaatje, Pixley Kaseme in 1906 in Colombia talks about Africans creating a different kind of civilization. And all nationalist leaders have been talking about a different set of morality. And so, you know, I get the fact that crass accumulation is inevitable, but I don't think that underplays the importance of moral consciousness. And by the way, there are those who were in a financial bind, but nonetheless resisted the lure of using office for financial gain. And Waile was amongst them. On the other point, and this is, the other point of whether primitive accumulation has led to the emergence of a black bourgeoisie. And this has been the disappointing thing. And it's so unashamedly and embarrassingly parasitic that it is blatantly consumptionist. Fancy shoes, fancy car, fancy stuff, nothing to show for it. It has not led to it. There is no one in PE of the previous councillors with all the monies that have been embezzled, millions and millions of them. I haven't seen anyone who has managed to set up something, some entrepreneurial activity or outfit. It's all about consumption, right? So it's parasitic. It's not even primitive accumulation, I guess, to answer your question directly. You might allude to that in your review. It's not even primitive accumulation for the purpose of building a material base. No, it's about satisfying immediate wants. Consumptionist. That's the disappointing part of it. They don't even steal smart. I think I've covered all the questions, but the last point, yes, just before I step off, I don't share your optimism, rather, Janet, on the future of PE, especially you seem to think that the United Front is progressive. I know you leftists, but not everything left is necessarily leftist. Or it might posture as left, but it may not be left. And in some cases, it might be left, but not necessarily be progressive. And United Front is one of those. Their leftist credentials are fake. I don't think they have any moral compass. I like using that strong language, as you say, because they the reason for that party's existence actually is to protect MAPU. You know MAPU. The manager in PE was being accused of all sorts of things, threatening people with guns, siphoning money in Human Settlement Department, Mvuleni MAPU, and he's now being charged. The only reason United Front enters into these alliances, or one of the main reasons, and the point that it always raises, is that it wants MAPU back as manager, mainly because MAPU is part of that organization. And possibly MAPU might have used some of the money that is siphoned to fund that party. So there is nothing nice or optimistic or that inspiring about the United Front. It's part of the rot, actually. And if you want any change in PE, I think you should wish for its demise rather than growth. Because if it grows, then you are likely to get even more trouble. But yes, Kusta will most likely do well because the ANC is going to face yet another pounding. Let me stop there.
All right. Thank you, Prof, for responding to the reviewers. Yeah, I was saying that I don't think that this conversation about the ANC and party politics and the issues of organizational dysfunctionality is exhaustive, of course. I think there obviously needs to be, a lot more study, especially on the different vantage points from which to look at the ANC. I think what I'm going to do now, given that, there's still the number that we have now, is given that there has been quite a lot of chat in the chat group, I'm just going to go through some of the commentary and perhaps questions that have been, directed to you. I'm not going to read, but I think there's a Crispian Olva who then had posed a question, and please you can say if I've misread or misunderstood the question. But there's been the issue around, there has been a missed opportunity on the part of the ANC that it had failed to heal itself at one point, and that one of the ways that it could have done so was to wean itself of the patronage resources to which it has become addicted to. Do you think, in that sense, this was one of the options available to the ANC?
Tapel, I've been going through the comments. I'm afraid I missed you there.
Okay, no, I was reading it for you. You don't have to go through them. I was gonna read them.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, and on one of the comments had been from a Crispian Oliver on the issue of missed opportunities for the ANC to heal itself, and perhaps one of the ways it could do that is to sort of wean itself of the patronage resources that it had become accustomed to. Do you think that is one of the ways it could have done so, as for the ANC to sort of reclaim the revolutionary values that that it had built under apartheid?
Well, certainly, yeah. I think that's one of the options that the ANC weighed, because they were very honest in their own introspection, and the ANC is good at that, beating themselves up, and the challenge is always following that harsh self-introspection. And one of the things they resolved on in 2016 was that they should stay away from power because power is toxic. It's not good for them. That's what they realized. So they need to stay away and reform and look at rebuilding the organization, mainly attracting good leaders, sifting, being more discerning about who they elect and all that. But then, as I say in the book, being out of office threatened their own livelihoods individually, as well as the sustainability of the organization. The treasurer at the time, Mbulelo something, admitted to a journalist that "Mntanam, asina mali." We don't have money.
Sure.
And you know, and they decided, you know what, to hell with this thing of staying out of office and trying to clean ourselves up. And that really confirms the point about the ANC being an instrument for accumulation. They had to go back by any means necessary. And so, yes, that was an opportunity. And maybe the ANC did not think hard enough about how it should restructure itself, if at all, as an opposition. And I remember Nasrek reflected on this. I remember listening to Joanna Titenge and Phoebe Potgieter presenting on organizational renewal, saying the ANC should accept the fact that they some of them are now in the opposition and think seriously about how they occupy that role going forward. And so they haven't done that. And I think the ANC also, it has operated pretty much like its own entrepreneurs, siphoning for immediate consumption. There's no investment in the party structure and saving for the party. And, that is why the ANC is perpetually bankrupt rather. Now Luthuli House, the website at Luthuli House is down. We can't access the website to get previous documents because they haven't paid service providers. You get the same thing even there, in PE, even though they were back in office at some point, but they still didn't have money to pay for electricity. And so you wonder, a party, how does the party run itself? These kickbacks that they get, this 10%, what happens to them? So there was never a serious reflection on how you build party's finances for the purpose of building the party. It's like there's no sense of a party outside of government as a structure that needs to be sustained on its own.
Sure.
But the party is imagined as an extension of government. Without incumbency, it doesn't exist. Yeah.
Sure. I think this would be, the last one that I could gather as well from the chat, and apologies for not getting everybody there. It's around the issue of, the movement from a liberation movement to then a political party, that perhaps the ANC had failed to mold itself into a modern political party, and how does that then look like? Given the timeline that you had suggested that all of these things were happening, in fact, prior to Polokwane, in the early stages during the transitional phases, in fact, in terms of the moral fabric and the values, revolutionary values of the ANC. How would you read the transition vis-a-vis liberation movement and then, a modern political party?
Well, I've never taken that discussion seriously of the ANC morphing into a political party. I don't quite know what it would look like if it were to be a political party different from what it is now.
Sure.
And secondly, it doesn't help for the ANC to shed off its liberation imagery because that's part of its legitimacy. What it should have done certainly was to inject a little bit of professionalism in its own operation and recognize the potential for its deployees to use office for personal gain, and therefore enforce strict disciplinary measures and codes of conduct. It didn't do that. And be more, run the organization, have a constant presence in the party headquarters. I'll tell you, for instance, the ANC has, with every election, they have answer sheets that they give volunteers. When they campaign, they do door-to-door campaigns for the party. And so, volunteers go there and they ask the occupant of the house, oh, what do you expect from the ANC? What do you want the ANC to address? And they get all these things, and people in the house sign to authenticate that a visit was done at that house. Then I guess they do look at these answer sheets as they go on with their campaign. I don't know. But what I know is that soon after that, they get rid of those answer sheets. So you don't get an organization that thinks of itself as a thinks about the future, is very reflective about things are done here and now, right? For tomorrow, you don't think about 2 weeks down the line. So the operations are very weak. So those things, I mean, I guess these are simple, basic things, but they are not done.
Okay. Prof, thank you for responding. I think at this point we're going to move on to the sort of second last session. I'm going to give it to Ndate Pilankai to just lead us through the next session. Then thereafter I'll come back again. Mr. Pila? Raymond, could you please unmute him? Raymond?
And he has been asked to unmute. He has been unable to unmute.
All right. Okay, I'm not sure why he's struggling to unmute. Okay. I think let me do this. What Mr. Pilangai was going to talk about was with regards to a follow-up session after this review symposium. We are then going to have a proper book review with our other partners that, you know, among them being Makana Legends, that Mr. Pilangai was going to take us through. That date will be communicated with everybody else that has been here. The purpose of that was obviously to move sort of from the sort of academic space into the you know, people who directly as well experience particularly local government policies, such as your health, obviously, and your transport. So when that moment comes, I think there will be an email sent out to everybody. But other than that, I just also want to thank everybody for coming, particularly the reviewers. I know it's quite late right now, so I do thank you for the time that you're given for this as well. I think also to Ndate Ndletyana to come and also speak about the book and respond to the reviewers. I think this has been a good session. I think the book was quite timely and it was quite important for us to understand where the ANC is. I don't think, again, that this is exhaustive and there has to be time and space for different ways of looking at the ANC. I think definitely people like Professor, Feroz has given different articulations of where the ANC could have been early on and where it is right now. But as it stands, I think, thank you again. I think I will be able to, I should release everybody to have that dinner. If any of the organizers, if I'm missing anything, please do say. But I think we're good. Okay, thank you to everybody.
Can I say something quickly, Tapelo?
Okay, Prof.
Can I just say something quickly? I see Pilar is there, but just to emphasize that the launch is going to be a community-based launch. It's going to be a launch that involves people from the community, because the impression is that the problems highlighted in this book ought to be dealt with from the ground up, so that people on the ground can actively participate in how to resolve the quagmire that we're currently in. But Pilar is with us now, and he can talk a bit more about what those plans are about.
Pilar, we're waiting for you. Tapelo, I think Pilar has a problem there.
Yeah.
I think Fred and you have said everything. Perhaps it's time to close.
Yes. Because I see him on the screen, but I don't see any audio.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we should close the meeting.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Let us head for dinner, and I'm going home. Have a good evening.
All right. Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you all.